higher, right? When you're 12, you have to be in that karate class. And if you're not in that karate class, there's no way you're going to be able to continue with life. So what happens? Your parents register you for the karate class. You go for 2 classes. You don't want to go to the third. You're sick of it. Now you've decided you want to do skiing, right? So now you go off and do skiing. This is how human beings are designed. They tend to jump around. They tend to lack their focus. Inna sa'yakum lashatta. Verily, your efforts, they're dispersed and they're spread, stated in the Quran. So the reality of life is that today we're very excited about the Hajj. But who knows? Tomorrow we may not care. You don't know. Tomorrow the desire may not exist. You think about even your own history within the deen. How many people come and think that, a few years ago I used to think about praying tahajjud. And the battle was at tahajjud. A few years ago I used to say, okay, I'm going to wake up every night for tahajjud. I used to wake up for at least half the time for tahajjud, right? And then you think about it and you say, well, now, 2, 3, 4 years later, the battle no longer is tahajjud. Now I'm just battling getting up for the fajr prayer, right? And who knows, 10 years later, you may not even be thinking about the prayer. And I've seen people go through these changes. That's why it's so important to come into these types of gatherings, to put ourselves next to one another, because person A is at their peak energy and person C is barely hanging on. And when those two people sit together, then they tend to save one another. So actually, it's through the gathering that we save one another. Today, I may be excited. Tomorrow, you may be excited. But hopefully, the whole group remains energetic when we remain together. But this is really important. Today you've got the energy, you've got the excitement, you've got the desire to go and apply yourself to this incredible act of worship. And it may not exist. It just may not exist. Allah may take away that tawfiq if you don't fulfill this mandate immediately. And so, again, this is just another reality of life. So number one, recognize that circumstances change. And this is a really important reason why anytime there's an act of worship before us, we should be quick towards it. And especially that something as important as the Hajj. Okay, the number 2 thing that the ulama discuss under this, when it comes to فَلْيَتَعَجَّلْ, is that this hadith is also reminding us that life is finite. Right? Life it's restricted. Again, it's the same thing that I mentioned concerning health. Nobody really sits and thinks that they're going to die tomorrow. We don't make that assumption. The assumption that we live on is that we're going to wake up the next day. When we go to bed, we set the alarm clock. We assume we're going to turn the alarm clock off in the morning. But believe me, for every individual, there comes a morning when the alarm clock goes off, but they may not wake up to turn it off. So we are not here forever. We have not been designed to be here forever, and we will not last here forever. Right? Nor do we have any control over how long we will be here. It'd be one thing if we knew we weren't going to be here forever, but everybody knew that at the age of 60 they'll pass away. In which case you would have some time to decide, okay, well let me wait a few years and then I'll do the Hajj. Number 1, we're not going to be here forever. And number 2, no one knows how long anyone is going to be here. It's very possible and probably likely that one person in this gathering right now may pass away in the next 2 to 3 years. In fact, that's our experience, right? Every year I can sit down and think about what's happened in the last year. We've lost a couple of young brothers in the last year. And the i'tikaf before that, I mentioned the same thing. And we lost a couple of brothers a year before that, right? Even though they were young, and despite the fact that none of us thought that they would disappear, they're not here now. So that's just the reality of life. Number 1, it's finite. And number 2, it's random, right? And number 3, obviously, death is not predictable. So based on this, number 1, that the first point, that circumstances change, and number 2, that life is finite, we should recognize that this is a very important ruling of the Prophet ﷺ, or statement of the Prophet ﷺ advising us concerning how we should treat the Hajj. So again, based on this hadith, and based on the direct command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our scholars have ruled that once the conditions for Hajj are met, that an individual must go immediately. It is a sin to delay it. Make it very clear. It is a sin to delay it. Now that sin is uplifted if you then fulfill it. Let's say that you're supposed to go for Hajj this year because you have the wealth, all right? And you don't go for some reason. That's a sin, and you are sinning. Now, it may be that 3 years later you end up going. When you go, the ulama write that that sin of delay is uplifted, but you're playing with fire. You understand? You are playing with fire when you put off the Hajj. And make that very clear. because of the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala after this ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, right, in the beginning of this talk, وَلِلَّهِ عَلَى النَّاسِ حِجُّ الْبَيْتِ مَنِ اسْتَطَاعَ إِلَيْهِ سَبِيلًا وَمَنْ كَفَرَ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ غَنِيٌّ عَنِ الْعَالَمِينَ. And the person who denies, right, the person who turns away from this particular responsibility, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from the world. He has no care. It's not that He needs you to go visit His home. He is free from you. If you want to be that type of individual, that a responsibility falls upon them, and then you turn away from that responsibility because you decided something else was more important, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free. He does not need us. He has no need for, His greatness is not dependent on us. There are two reasons why people generally delay the Hajj. Number one is external. Number two is internal. What are external things that cause people to delay the Hajj? For example, they say that, well, my cousin is getting married this year, and my cousin happened to schedule her wedding on this particular date, and these are the dates of Hajj, so I can't go. Right? That's not an excuse. You have a responsibility to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's where your primary responsibility lies. We don't go to our cousin's marriage because it's our cousin, because the cousin told us to come. The salik, the person seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, goes to the cousin's marriage because Allah told you to fulfill the rights of your relationships. That's why we go to the cousin's marriage. Not because the cousin is going to get upset at us if we don't go. So in the same way, when a right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala supersedes the cousin's marriage, then we go to fulfill that right of Allah. We are servants of Allah. And that's the way by which we judge the deeds that we do. So in this particular case, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mandates upon you the Hajj, and you have the means to go for the Hajj, that will not be classified as an excuse. Okay, similarly, many people like to make the excuse, well, I'm in school right now. I have a few years of schooling left, and when my schooling finishes, then I'm going to go for the Hajj. That's not an excuse. And that's a very tough one to swallow, because we have made school almost an idol. All right? We do things that we would not do for anything else that we do for school. We amass debt, become slaves, get tied to a bank for the next 30, 40 years because they put us into debt forever. Right? We do all these things in order to get to school and to go to school that we would never do for anything else. And so we begin to think that because we have school, we can't go for the Hajj. If you are an individual that has the wealth and the ability to go for Hajj, it is mandatory on you to go even if you're in school. Look, when you're young, then it seems like every semester is the most important thing. The reality is you can easily take off a semester. How many people take off semesters? There's so many people that take off semesters. You figure this out when you're actually in school. People take off a semester to go study in Africa. People take off a semester because they want to go do something that they enjoy. People take off a year because they want to earn some money in order to decrease their debt load in school. Whatever it is, you can take off a semester, you can take off a quarter. It's not a big deal. But missing the Hajj is a potentially big deal. Right? Let's say that you thought you're in school, so you thought that you can do the Hajj later. Something happens, you get sick. Something happens, you pass away. Something happens, you lose your jazba for the deen. Then what do? Now you're in serious trouble because it was mandatory and you never fulfilled it. So don't let these external excuses confuse you. Anytime you have a situation like this, you can take it to the scholars and discuss it with the scholars and find out how your situation works out. But if Hajj is, you have the ability to go to Hajj, do not let these external situations derail you from getting there. Now the second reason, or the second means of delay is internal. And basically it's procrastination. It's human nature. We all procrastinate. You have a paper due on Friday, the professor assigns it 2 weeks before it's due, you do it on Thursday night, right? Because that's human nature. But see, the thing is, in that case, you know that there's a 2-week period. And you know that Thursday night will come and you can get it in on Friday. But the problem here again is that your life is limited. And you don't know when it's going to be cut off. It's sort of like there's this machine just cutting off people's lives and closing it off for them. But you just never know when you're going to come under that machine. So do not procrastinate in this thing. You can procrastinate in other things, you'll survive. But the general principle of the deen is that in acts of worship you don't procrastinate. The Prophet ﷺ in hadith mentions that one of the best deeds is to pray salah at its time, in the beginning of its time, for example. And that's because when you pray it in the beginning of its time, you're going to get it. If you procrastinate and push it off to the end of its time, you may get it, but eventually it's going to